Good evening. 3 winters ago, Clarence Raby watched his younger brother strapped into the state's electric chair, still claiming he'd been framed. Tonight, 19 law officers who've helped put him there.
Between August 15th and October 3rd, 1951, 19 county sheriff's deputies disappeared across a 100-mile stretch of western North Carolina mountains during intensive manhunt for Clarence Raby, who'd sworn at his brother's execution 5 months earlier that every law enforcement officer involved in wrongful conviction and death sentence would pay with their own lives for sending innocent man to electric chair based on perjured testimony and manufactured evidence. By October 10th, all 19 were dead, their bodies discovered in locations deliberately chosen to mark every courthouse, jail, and police station where deputies had participated in investigation, arrest, trial, and execution that had killed James Raby for murder he'd never committed, crime that actual perpetrator had confessed to 3 weeks after execution had already occurred. The perpetrator was Clarence Raby, 34-year-old former Army Ranger who'd fought in Pacific Theater during World War II, had learned jungle warfare tactics that translated perfectly to Appalachian mountains where he'd grown up hunting and tracking, who'd earned nickname Mountain Ghost from law enforcement officers who'd spent 7 weeks pursuing him without ever getting close enough to make arrest, despite deploying over 200 deputies and state troopers throughout region. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation would classify it as deadliest manhunt in state history, unprecedented case where single individual had systematically eliminated 19 law enforcement officers through campaign requiring tactical sophistication and sustained violence that authorities couldn't prevent despite overwhelming numerical superiority and resources devoted to capture. But motive wasn't random cop killing or criminal enterprise protecting operations from legitimate enforcement. It was brother delivering justice for judicial murder, proving that badges and courtroom verdicts provided no protection against man defending family honor by eliminating everyone who'd participated in sending innocent brother to death row through investigation and prosecution so corrupted by ambition and incompetence that actual murderer's confession after execution had been dismissed as attention-seeking rather than acknowledged as evidence that judicial system had executed wrong man. If you're ready to hear how Mountain Ghost became deadliest solo cop killer in North Carolina history, systematically hunting 19 deputies who'd sent his brother to electric chair, hit that subscribe button. But understand this story contains dramatized account of systematic violence against law enforcement officers during early 1950s when wrongful convictions were common and when legal remedies for proven innocence were inadequate to prevent executions of people whose guilt was questionable at best. Rutherford County, North Carolina occupied 566 square miles of Blue Ridge Mountain foothills in 1951. Populated by 47,000 people, mostly working textile mills or tobacco farms, or small businesses serving regional economy still recovering from depression and adjusting to post-war prosperity that hadn't reached Appalachian communities as completely as it had transformed other parts of nation. The county seat, Rutherfordton, held 4,000 residents around courthouse, representing justice system that functioned with limited resources and often rushed cases through prosecution and trial with inadequate investigation or defense, prioritizing conviction rates over accuracy when ambitious prosecutors sought career advancement through successful prosecutions regardless of actual guilt. March 1951 meant temperatures warming into 60s during day, dogwoods blooming throughout mountains, spring planting season when farmers prepared fields for crops that would sustain them through year if weather cooperated and prices remained stable enough to cover costs that seemed to rise faster than crop values. James Raby was 32 years old in March 1951, lived with his wife Martha and 2 children on small farm outside Rutherfordton where he'd grown up. Worked construction jobs supplementing farm income that barely supported family even during good years. He'd served in Army during war alongside younger brother Clarence, had returned in 1945 to resume life that had been interrupted by military service, established reputation throughout community as reliable worker and devoted family man, who paid debts and helped neighbors and never caused trouble beyond occasional drinking. That was universal practice among mountain men who viewed alcohol consumption as social activity rather than vice requiring legal regulation. James had no criminal record, had never been arrested or investigated for any crime, was last person anyone would have suspected of violence or criminal behavior that went beyond minor traffic violations that everyone accumulated over years of driving mountain roads. The murder that would destroy Raby family occurred March 18, 1951, when store owner Samuel Morrison was found shot dead during apparent robbery at his general store on highway outside Rutherfordton. Morrison had been killed by single gunshot to head. Store's cash register had been emptied of approximately $200. No witnesses had seen crime occur during late evening hours when store was usually empty except for Morrison, who kept business open until 9 to serve customers traveling highway. Sheriff's deputies investigated for 2 days without identifying suspects, pressured by community demanding arrests and by county commissioners who'd received complaints that crime rate was increasing and that law enforcement needed to demonstrate capability for solving violent crimes that threatened public safety. Deputy Marcus Webb, who led investigation, had known Morrison personally, had felt pressure to solve case quickly, to demonstrate competence, and to advance career through successful prosecution of high-profile murder. Webb identified James Raby as suspect based on tip from confidential informant who claimed to have seen James near Morrison's store on evening of murder, information that was uncorroborated, and that came from source whose credibility was questionable. But that gave Webb lead he needed to make arrest that would show progress in investigation. Webb didn't conduct thorough investigation of James's alibi, didn't search for physical evidence connecting him to crime, didn't interview witnesses who could have confirmed James had been elsewhere when murder occurred. Instead, Webb arrested James March 21st, charged him with first-degree murder based solely on informant's tip, filed charging documents claiming investigation had established probable cause when actually minimal investigation had been conducted before arrest. James's alibi was straightforward and verifiable. He'd been home with Martha and children on evening of March 18th, hadn't left property except to feed livestock around 8 in evening, had been visible to neighbors who'd driven past farm around time. Murder had occurred miles away at Morrison's store. But Webb dismissed alibi as convenient family testimony that couldn't be trusted, didn't interview neighbors who could have corroborated that James had been home, presented case to prosecutor, focusing on informant's identification rather than investigating whether actual evidence supported charging James with murder he hadn't committed. The prosecutor was ambitious district attorney named Robert Davidson, who'd been elected on promise of being tough on crime, who saw Morrison murder as opportunity to demonstrate effectiveness through securing conviction in high-profile case that would generate positive publicity supporting future political ambitions. Davidson charged James with first-degree murder carrying automatic death penalty under North Carolina law, proceeded to trial in June 1951, despite defense attorney's objections, that investigation had been inadequate, and that prosecution's case relied entirely on single informant whose identity remained confidential and whose credibility couldn't be challenged without revealing source. Trial lasted 3 days. Prosecution presenting testimony from confidential informant who claimed to have seen James near store on evening of murder, offering no physical evidence connecting James to crime, but arguing that circumstantial case was sufficient for conviction when combined with informant's eyewitness identification. Defense attorney attempted to present alibi witnesses, including Martha and neighbors who'd seen James at home, but prosecutor successfully argued that family testimony was inherently unreliable and that neighbors' observations hadn't been precise enough to establish exact timeline proving James couldn't have traveled to Morrison's store and returned home in window when murder had occurred. Jury deliberated 4 hours before returning guilty verdict, apparently persuaded by prosecutor's argument that confidential informant had no motive to lie and that defense's alibi witnesses were attempting to protect family member regardless of actual guilt. Judge sentenced James to death as required by North Carolina law for first-degree murder convictions, scheduled execution for August 15, 1951, giving defense limited time to file appeals that had minimal chance of success given that state appeals courts rarely overturned jury verdicts based on sufficiency of evidence. James maintained his innocence throughout trial and subsequent appeals, told Martha and Clarence that he'd never been near Morrison's store on evening of murder, That confidential informant had lied for reasons he couldn't understand, but that probably involved settling personal vendetta or seeking reward money that prosecutor had offered for information leading to conviction. Clarence Raby attended every day of trial, watched as prosecution presented case that relied on single uncorroborated witness, observed how prosecutor had manipulated jury through emotional appeals about need to deliver justice for Morrison's family, while avoiding discussion of whether actual evidence proved James had committed murder. Clarence understood immediately that his brother was being railroaded through judicial system that prioritized convictions over truth. That prosecutor's ambition and deputies' incompetent investigation had combined to prosecute innocent man because solving case quickly was more important than solving it correctly. He approached defense attorney after guilty verdict, demanded to know what could be done to prevent execution when James was innocent, was told that appeals had limited grounds and that proving innocence after conviction was nearly impossible without new evidence that directly contradicted trial testimony. Clarence hired private investigator in July 1951, paid him to conduct thorough investigation that Webb's deputies should have performed before arresting James, discovered within week that confidential informant was Kevin Patterson, local man who'd had business dispute with James over construction work that James had performed but that Patterson had refused to pay for, claiming work had been inadequate, though actually Patterson had simply decided not to pay after James had completed job satisfactorily. Patterson had used tip about seeing James near Morrison's store as revenge for James taking him to small claims court over unpaid debt, had fabricated testimony that prosecutor had accepted without verification because successful conviction was more important than ensuring testimony was truthful. The private investigator also discovered that actual murderer was Patterson's cousin, Samuel Patterson, who'd confessed to family members that he'd killed Morrison during robbery. That family had kept quiet about confession because protecting Samuel was more important than preventing innocent man's execution. Clarence presented private investigators' findings to defense attorney in early August, demanded that new evidence be submitted to court proving James's innocence and identifying actual murderer. Defense attorney filed emergency motion for new trial based on newly discovered evidence, requested stay of execution scheduled for August 15th while court reviewed investigators' findings. District Attorney Davidson opposed motion, argued that private investigators' findings were unreliable and that Samuel Patterson's alleged confession to family members was hearsay that didn't meet legal standards for evidence that could overturn jury verdict. Judge denied motion for new trial. August 10th ruled that private investigators' findings weren't sufficient to establish James's innocence conclusively, maintained that jury's verdict deserved deference, and that post-conviction evidence needed to be overwhelming to justify overturning conviction that had been obtained through proper procedures. James Raby was executed August 15, 1951, at Central Prison in Raleigh, died in electric chair maintaining his innocence to final moment, left behind wife and 2 children, whose lives had been destroyed by wrongful conviction that had been obtained through perjured testimony and inadequate investigation that ambitious prosecutor and incompetent deputies had preferred over conducting thorough examination of whether actual evidence supported charging him with murder. Clarence attended execution, watched through observation window as guards strapped brother into chair and administered electrical current that killed him within 3 minutes, heard final words where James had asked God to forgive everyone who'd participated in his execution and to protect Martha and children from poverty that would result from losing primary breadwinner to judicial murder. Clarence left execution chamber, understanding that legal system had failed completely, that appeals courts had rubber-stamped wrongful conviction because overturning jury verdicts would have acknowledged institutional failures that judges preferred to ignore, that his brother had been executed not because he was guilty, but because prosecutor had been ambitious, and deputies had been lazy, and jury had been manipulated into believing perjured testimony from witness motivated by personal vendetta. He drove back to Rutherfordton that evening, stopped at cemetery where James would be buried following day, made vow at gravesite that every law enforcement officer who'd participated in investigation, prosecution, and execution would pay with their own lives for judicial murder that had killed innocent man. Samuel Patterson confessed publicly to Morrison murder September 3, 1951, 3 weeks after James's execution, apparently consumed by guilt about cousin's false testimony that had sent innocent man to death row. Patterson provided details about murder that only actual perpetrator could have known, described how he'd shot Morrison during robbery, explained that he'd hidden murder weapon in location where it was subsequently recovered, by authorities confirming his confession was genuine rather than false attention-seeking. District Attorney Davidson dismissed confession as unreliable, argued that Patterson was mentally unstable and seeking attention through false confessions that unfortunately came too late to save James Raby, but that didn't prove James had been innocent because jury had found him guilty based on evidence presented at trial. Davidson's refusal to acknowledge wrongful conviction was motivated by political considerations. Admitting his prosecution had executed innocent man would have destroyed career and would have triggered lawsuits from Martha Raby seeking damages for judicial murder that had been accomplished through perjured testimony and inadequate investigation. Patterson's confession triggered Clarence's systematic campaign, proved that everything Clarence had suspected was true, that his brother had been executed for crime he hadn't committed, that prosecutor and deputies had known, or should have known, that their investigation was inadequate, and that confidential informant's testimony was motivated by personal vendetta. Clarence spent 2 weeks after confession planning systematic elimination of 19 law enforcement officers who'd participated in James's investigation, arrest, trial, and execution. He identified all participants, researched their routines and vulnerabilities, created detailed targeting plan that would eliminate every officer beginning with those most directly responsible for wrongful conviction and proceeding through everyone who'd contributed even minimally to process that had sent innocent man to electric chair. Clarence's advantages were extraordinary combination of military training and mountain knowledge, skills that made him deadliest opponent law enforcement would ever face in North Carolina. He'd served as Army Ranger in Pacific Theater during World War II, had conducted operations behind Japanese lines in Philippines and New Guinea, had learned jungle warfare tactics including ambush techniques and evasion strategies that translated perfectly to Appalachian mountains where he'd grown up. He understood how to move silently through forests, how to establish concealed positions from which he could observe without being detected, how to strike quickly and disappear before authorities could respond. Most significantly, he understood that systematic campaign required discipline and patience that most criminals lacked, that eliminating 19 officers would require months of sustained operations during which he'd need to avoid capture, despite massive manhunt that would inevitably be deployed after Patton emerged. The systematic elimination began August 20th, 5 days after James's execution, and 2 weeks before Patterson's confession would prove James had been innocent. Deputy Thomas Mitchell, who'd been Webb's second-in-command during investigation, was found dead in his patrol car on isolated road, shot through head by sniper who'd disappeared before backup could arrive. Mitchell had participated in arrest, despite knowing investigation was inadequate, had filed reports corroborating Webb's claims that probable cause existed when actually minimal investigation had been conducted. His death sent message that execution wouldn't go unavenged, that officers who'd participated in railroading innocent man to death row would face consequences that badges couldn't protect them from when family members decided judicial murder required extrajudicial response. Deputy Marcus Webb died August 25th, shot while entering his home in Rutherfordton, killed by sniper positioned on ridge 300 yards away. Systematic violence that demonstrated perpetrator possessed military-grade marksmanship and tactical planning. Webb had led investigation that had arrested James without adequate evidence, had relied on confidential informant without verifying testimony, had dismissed alibi witnesses without conducting interviews that would have confirmed James had been home when murder occurred. His death eliminated primary officer responsible for wrongful conviction, made clear that systematic campaign was targeting specific individuals based on their roles in James's prosecution rather than attacking law enforcement randomly. District Attorney Robert Davidson died September 5th, 2 days after Samuel Patterson's confession had proven James Raby had been innocent and that Davidson's prosecution had executed wrong man. Davidson was shot while walking to courthouse where he'd prosecuted James 5 months earlier, killed by sniper who'd positioned himself in building overlooking route that prosecutor traveled daily. Davidson's death was particularly significant because he'd refused to acknowledge wrongful conviction, even after actual murderer had confessed, had prioritized protecting his career over admitting he'd sent innocent man to electric chair through prosecution that had relied on perjured testimony and that had ignored exculpatory evidence that defense attorney had attempted to present. Additional deputies died throughout September, despite intensive manhunt that deployed over 100 law enforcement officers throughout Rutherford County, attempting to locate and apprehend perpetrator who'd become known as Mountain Ghost for his ability to strike without warning and disappear completely before authorities could respond. 2 deputies were killed September 8th, during patrol they'd conducted specifically to search for shooter, ambushed from concealed position and eliminated before they could radio for help. 3 more died September 12th, when their vehicle was disabled by gunfire and they were picked off systematically while attempting to find cover. Tactical sophistication that convinced authorities they were facing opponent with military training, rather than ordinary criminal whose capabilities could be predicted and countered through standard law enforcement procedures. Sheriff William Bradford, who'd overseen department during James's investigation and who'd testified at trial about procedures his deputies had followed, was killed September 18th, shot while attending church service where he'd believed himself safe from violence that had claimed 8 officers. Bradford's death demonstrated that nowhere was safe when Mountain Ghost had decided target needed elimination. That assumption about shooter operating only in isolated areas where escape routes were available was wrong when perpetrator possessed confidence and skill to strike in populated locations and still evade capture. Bradford's role in wrongful conviction had been administrative oversight of incompetent investigation, had failed to ensure that deputies conducted thorough examination of evidence before arresting James, had testified at trial that department's procedures had been followed properly when actually investigation had been rushed and inadequate. By September 25th, 15 law enforcement officers were dead. Manhunt had expanded to include FBI and North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation agents who deployed over 200 officers throughout western North Carolina attempting to locate perpetrator, who'd eliminated 15 targets across 5 weeks without ever being spotted or identified despite massive resources devoted to capture. Authorities knew they were looking for someone connected to James Raby, understood that systematic campaign was revenge for execution, but couldn't determine which family member or associate was responsible because Clarence had been careful to avoid creating evidence connecting him to murders. He'd used different weapons for different killings to prevent ballistics from connecting attacks, had varied his methods and locations to avoid establishing patterns that authorities could predict and counter, had maintained normal public appearances between operations to avoid creating timeline gaps that would suggest his involvement. The final 4 officers died October 1st through 3rd during coordinated attacks that demonstrated Mountain Ghost's capability for complex operations requiring simultaneous strikes at multiple locations. 3 deputies involved in transporting James to Central Prison for execution were killed October 1st when their vehicles were ambushed on mountain roads, systematic elimination that required precise timing and multiple firing positions, suggesting single shooter moving rapidly between locations. Final deputy who testified at trial about finding James near Morrison's store on evening of murder, testimony that appeals court had subsequently revealed was perjured because deputy had never actually seen James at location and had only reported seeing someone who might have been him, was killed October 3rd outside his home in coordinated strike that occurred simultaneously with attacks on other targets. Tactical complexity that convinced authorities they were facing opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything law enforcement could match without military support. FBI and state investigators suspended active manhunt operations October 5th after 19 officers had been killed across 7 weeks, acknowledged that continuing to deploy officers in region where Mountain Ghost could strike without warning would result in additional casualties without realistic prospect of capture. The decision represented unprecedented federal and state law enforcement failure, admission that single individual had defeated massive manhunt through combination of tactical sophistication and intimate knowledge of terrain that gave him insurmountable advantages over officers who were outsiders to region and who lacked combat experience that Mountain Ghost had acquired through Army service. The suspension meant Clarence Raby would never be captured during active operations, that if he was ever apprehended, it would be through investigation connecting him to evidence, rather than through direct confrontation that he'd proven capable of winning repeatedly. Investigation continued through October and November 1951. Hundreds interviewed, ballistics examined, movements traced. Attempts made to establish connections between Clarence Raby and 19 murders that everyone suspected he'd committed, but that couldn't be proven without witnesses or physical evidence. Clarence maintained normal public appearances throughout investigation, attended James's gravesite regularly to mourn brother whose execution had motivated systematic campaign, expressed appropriate horror when discussing officer deaths in conversations with neighbors and acquaintances who had no idea they were speaking with perpetrator of deadliest manhunt in North Carolina history. His performance was masterful deception, presenting grieving brother persona while concealing capabilities that had enabled elimination of 19 trained law enforcement officers through 7-week campaign requiring sustained violence and tactical sophistication that authorities couldn't counter despite overwhelming resources. The investigation collapsed in December 1951 when prosecutors acknowledged they couldn't develop case-meeting evidentiary standards for prosecution. That circumstantial connection between Clarence and murders wasn't sufficient for conviction when physical evidence and witnesses were absent. That Mountain Ghost had executed campaign so carefully that proving his identity beyond reasonable doubt would be impossible without confession or dramatic mistake that would connect him definitively to crimes. The outcome meant Clarence would never be prosecuted, despite being widely known throughout Rutherford County as brother who'd avenged James's execution through systematic elimination of everyone involved in wrongful conviction, that he'd spend remaining years as free man, protected by lack of evidence, even though community understood what he'd done. Clarence Raby lived quietly in Rutherfordton through subsequent decades, never remarried after wife divorced him in 1953, citing emotional distance and personality changes following James's execution, devoted himself to supporting Martha and her children, who'd been left impoverished by James's death, maintained homestead where he'd grown up and where both brothers had learned skills that had enabled one to farm peacefully and other to hunt 19 law enforcement officers systematically. He died in 1987 at age 70, heart attack taking him while working on property, buried beside James in cemetery, where he'd sworn vow that every officer involved in execution would pay with their own lives for judicial murder. The legacy persists in debates about wrongful convictions and violent resistance to judicial failures, about whether killing 19 officers could be justified when actual murderer's confession proved brother had been innocent, about what remedies exist when legal system executes wrong person and then refuses to acknowledge error even after truth emerges. The Mountain Ghost case demonstrated that some wrongful convictions trigger responses that judicial system can't prevent or punish when victims' families possess capabilities and determination to deliver retribution that badges can't protect against, that executing innocent people carries risks beyond civil liability when family members decide systematic violence is only response to judicial murder that authorities refuse to acknowledge occurred. The immediate aftermath of Clarence Raby's systematic elimination of 19 law enforcement officers created unprecedented crisis for North Carolina's judicial and law enforcement institutions. Forced examination of how wrongful conviction had proceeded to execution despite evidence of innocence, how actual murderer's confession 3 weeks after execution had been dismissed as attention-seeking rather than acknowledged as proof that state had killed wrong man. The crisis was compounded by fact that everyone in Rutherford County understood Clarence had killed 19 officers, but that authorities couldn't prove it, that Mountain Ghost had executed campaigns so meticulously that prosecution was impossible despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence suggesting his guilt. The situation created cognitive dissonance throughout community, where residents simultaneously mourned dead officers while understanding their deaths had been motivated by judicial murder that state refused to acknowledge or remedy. District Attorney Robert Davidson's career survived initially, despite his role in James Raby's wrongful conviction and his dismissal of Samuel Patterson's confession as unreliable attention-seeking. Davidson maintained position that jury's verdict had been based on evidence presented at trial. That post-conviction confession couldn't overturn legally obtained conviction, without evidence proving confession was genuine rather than false statement from mentally unstable persons seeking notoriety. His position was technically defensible under legal standards that placed high burden on overturning jury verdicts, but morally indefensible when actual murderer had provided details only perpetrator could have known, and when murder weapon had been recovered from location Patterson had specified. Davidson's refusal to acknowledge error was motivated by political survival. Admitting he'd prosecuted innocent man would have destroyed career and would have opened state to massive civil liability from Martha Raby and her children. But Davidson's position became untenable in November 1951 when investigative journalist named Marcus Thompson published comprehensive examination of James Raby case in Charlotte Observer, documenting how confidential informant Kevin Patterson's testimony had been motivated by business dispute rather than genuine eyewitness observation, how Deputy Webb's investigation had been rushed and inadequate, how prosecutor had dismissed defense's alibi witnesses without proper consideration, how judge had denied emergency motion for new trial despite private investigators' findings proving James's innocence. Thompson's investigation included interview with Samuel Patterson, who reiterated confession and provided additional details about murder that confirmed he was actual perpetrator, included statements from Kevin Patterson's former business associates describing his reputation for vindictiveness and his specific threats against James after small claims court judgment had required him to pay debt he'd attempted to avoid. Thompson's articles generated statewide outrage, demands that Davidson resign or be removed from office, calls for investigation into how wrongful conviction had proceeded to execution, despite multiple opportunities to prevent judicial murder. North Carolina Governor William Umstead ordered Attorney General Harry McMullen to investigate James Raby case in December 1951, determine whether prosecutors' conduct had violated ethical obligations or criminal statutes, recommend reforms that would prevent similar wrongful executions from occurring in future. McMullen's investigation lasted 6 months, included interviews with all participants in James's trial and appeals, examination of evidence that had been presented or withheld, analysis of how Samuel Patterson's confession had been evaluated and dismissed. McMullen's report, released June 1952, was devastating indictment of multiple failures throughout judicial process. Report concluded that Deputy Webb's investigation had been grossly inadequate, that confidential informant's testimony should have been corroborated before arrest was made, that Kevin Patterson's motivation for providing false testimony should have been investigated when defense raised questions about his credibility. Report found that Prosecutor Davidson had prioritized conviction over truth, had dismissed exculpatory evidence without proper consideration, had opposed new trial motion based on procedural technicalities rather than examining whether actual murderer's confession proved James's innocence. Report concluded that Judge Thomas Wilson had erred in denying emergency motion for new trial. That evidence presented by defense should have been sufficient to grant stay of execution pending thorough investigation of Samuel Patterson's confession. Most significantly, McMullen's report concluded that James Raby had been almost certainly innocent of murder for which he'd been executed, that Samuel Patterson's confession was credible and should have been investigated thoroughly rather than dismissed as attention-seeking. Report recommended that James be granted posthumous pardon based on innocence, that Martha Raby and children be compensated for wrongful execution, that procedural reforms be implemented to prevent similar failures from resulting in future wrongful convictions and executions. The recommendations were controversial, because posthumous pardons based on innocence were virtually unprecedented in American legal history, because compensating wrongful execution victims would establish expensive precedent, because implementing recommended reforms would require admitting that judicial system had systemic failures that had killed innocent person. Governor Umstead faced impossible political situation in summer 1952. Unable to ignore Attorney General's findings that James had been innocent, but unwilling to grant posthumous pardon that would acknowledge state had executed wrong man and had then covered up error by dismissing actual murderer's confession. Umstead's compromise was bureaucratic masterpiece, avoiding full accountability while implementing some reforms. He granted clemency recommendation, acknowledging that substantial questions existed about conviction, without explicitly declaring James innocent. He authorized $25,000 payment to Martha Raby, characterized as humanitarian assistance. Rather than compensation for wrongful execution, he ordered implementation of reforms requiring more thorough investigation before death penalty cases proceeded to trial, and requiring judicial review of post-conviction evidence that might establish innocence. The compromise satisfied no one completely. Martha Raby appreciated financial assistance that would help raise children without James, but wanted full acknowledgement of husband's innocence and official apology for judicial murder. Families of 19 dead officers opposed any suggestion that wrongful conviction had justified Clarence's systematic violence, argued that even if James had been innocent, the killing of 19 law enforcement officers was inexcusable terrorism that deserved prosecution regardless of prosecutorial failures that had triggered retribution. Davidson survived politically, but his career advancement ended. His ambition to become federal prosecutor abandoned after McMullen report documented his ethical failures. His reputation permanently damaged by association with wrongful execution, even though he'd avoided criminal charges or disbarment. Deputy Marcus Webb and Sheriff William Bradford were already dead, killed by Clarence during systematic elimination campaign, but McMullen reports criticism of their investigative failures triggered broader examination of Sheriff's Department procedures and competence. County commissioners ordered external review of all closed cases where deputies had relied on confidential informants without corroboration, discovered pattern of rushed investigations that prioritized quick arrests over thorough examination of evidence, identified multiple cases where suspects had been charged, based on minimal investigation that should have included additional inquiry before prosecutions proceeded. The review didn't result in overturning other convictions, but exposed systemic problems that had enabled James Raby's wrongful conviction and that suggested similar failures had affected other cases throughout department's history. Kevin Patterson faced perjury charges in August 1952 for testimony that had convicted innocent man. Prosecution, finally pursuing case after Attorney General's investigation, had exposed that his identification of James near Morrison's store had been fabricated to settle business dispute. Patterson's trial in October 1952 became proxy for broader questions about prosecutorial reliance on confidential informants whose motivations weren't adequately investigated before their testimony sent defendants to death row. Prosecutors presented evidence that Patterson had never actually seen James near store on evening of murder, that his testimony had been revenge for small claims judgment requiring him to pay debt, that his cooperation with prosecutor had been motivated by desire to harm James rather than by civic duty to provide genuine evidence of criminal activity. Patterson was convicted on all counts November 1952, sentenced to 10 years in state prison for perjury that had sent innocent man to death row, harshest penalty ever imposed in North Carolina, for false testimony, but sentence that many viewed as inadequate, given that his lies had triggered judicial murder and subsequent violence that had killed 19 officers. Samuel Patterson's legal situation was more complicated because his confession to Morrison murder had come after James's execution and after Clarence had already killed multiple officers. Prosecutors charged Samuel with first-degree murder in January 1953, presented evidence, including his detailed confession and recovery of murder weapon from location he'd specified. obtained conviction that everyone acknowledged was appropriate, given that Samuel was actual perpetrator of crime for which James had been executed. But Samuel's trial also served as implicit acknowledgement that James had been innocent, that state had executed wrong man. That judicial system's failures had created situation where actual murderer had remained free for 5 months, while innocent man had been investigated, convicted, and killed. Samuel was sentenced to death March 1953, creating situation where actual murderer of Samuel Morrison would face same electric chair that had killed James Raby for crime James hadn't committed. Samuel Patterson's execution was scheduled for August 15, 1953, exactly 2 years after James Raby had died, in same electric chair for same crime. The symmetry was noted by media covering case, generated debates about whether Samuel's execution represented justice, or whether executing actual murderer couldn't repair damage that had been done by executing innocent man 2 years earlier. Martha Raby attended Samuel's execution, sat in same observation room where Clarence had watched James die, told reporters afterward that watching actual murderer die provided no satisfaction because it couldn't bring James back or erase trauma that wrongful conviction and execution had inflicted on her family. Her statement captured profound truth that capital punishment advocates often overlooked. Executing guilty person after innocent person had already been killed didn't restore justice, merely added another death to tragedy that had begun with prosecutorial ambition and investigative incompetence. Clarence Raby maintained low profile throughout these developments, never publicly acknowledged his role in eliminating 19 officers, but his satisfaction with outcomes was obvious to anyone who knew him. He'd accomplished what legal system couldn't or wouldn't do, delivered accountability for James's wrongful execution through systematic violence that had eliminated everyone involved in investigation, prosecution, and execution that had killed innocent man. Kevin Patterson's conviction and Samuel Patterson's execution represented delayed official justice that wouldn't have occurred without Clarence's campaign forcing authorities to re-examine case they'd preferred to leave buried after dismissing actual murderer's confession as unreliable attention-seeking. The 19 officers' deaths had served as catalyst, forcing institutional acknowledgement of failures that otherwise would have been covered up permanently. But Clarence paid permanent price for systematic violence, even though he'd never been prosecuted. His marriage to wife Helen collapsed in 1953. She filed for divorce citing emotional distance and personality changes since James's execution, unable to live with man she suspected had killed 19 people, even if those killings had been motivated by brother's wrongful execution. Divorce was granted with Helen receiving custody of their 2 children, Clarence accepting arrangement because he understood that association with mountain ghost legend made him unsuitable parent for raising children in community where his violent reputation would follow them throughout lives. He maintained homestead alone through subsequent decades, devoted significant portion of income to supporting Martha and James's children, became uncle figure in their lives, compensating somewhat for absence of father who'd been executed for crime he hadn't committed. Martha Raby struggled financially and emotionally through 1950s despite $25,000 payment from state, amount that helped but couldn't replace lost income from James's construction work or repair psychological damage from watching husband convicted and executed based on perjured testimony. She never remarried, devoted herself to raising children and preserving James's memory as innocent man, who'd been murdered by state through judicial process so corrupted by ambition and incompetence that actual perpetrator's confession after execution had been dismissed rather than acknowledged as proof of innocence. Martha became advocate for wrongful conviction reform, testified before North Carolina legislature about need for stronger protections against false testimony from confidential informants, argued that death penalty should be abolished because executing innocent people was inevitable when prosecutors prioritized convictions over truth and when judges deferred to jury verdicts regardless of post-conviction evidence proving innocence. Martha died in 1979 at age 60, cancer taking her before she could see full acknowledgement of James's innocence that she'd fought for throughout 28 years since execution. Her death meant that both James's wife and brother, who'd known absolutely that he'd been innocent, were gone before state officially declared what everyone had known since Samuel Patterson's confession in 1951, that judicial system had executed wrong man and had then covered up error through denying post-conviction evidence and dismissing actual murderer's confession. Martha's obituary described her as widow of James Raby, executed 1951, without mentioning wrongful conviction explicitly, continuing pattern of official reluctance to acknowledge judicial murder even when overwhelming evidence proved innocence. Clarence Raby died February 8, 1987, at age 70, massive heart attack taking him while working on Homestead, where he'd lived alone for 34 years following divorce. His funeral drew over 300 mourners from throughout Rutherford County, testament to legendary status he'd achieved as mountain ghost, who'd eliminated 19 law enforcement officers through systematic campaign requiring tactical sophistication that authorities had never countered successfully. Multiple speakers delivered eulogies celebrating Clarence as devoted brother who'd defended family honor when legal system had failed, carefully worded tributes that never explicitly acknowledged he'd killed 19 officers, but that everyone understood referenced systematic elimination campaign that had forced state to re-examine wrongful conviction it had preferred to keep buried. James's children, William age 44 and Sarah age 41 in 1987, attended Uncle's funeral, delivered joint eulogy acknowledging that Clarence had devoted life to supporting them after father's wrongful execution, that his sacrifice had enabled them to receive educations and build lives that wouldn't have been possible without financial and emotional support he'd provided throughout childhood and adulthood. They stopped just short of thanking him explicitly for avenging father's death through systematic violence, but their meaning was clear to everyone present. Clarence had delivered justice that legal system had denied, had ensured that officers who'd participated in wrongful conviction had paid with their lives for judicial murder that state had refused to acknowledge or remedy. The eulogy was controversial, even at funeral attended by residents who'd known Clarence's role for 36 years. Some believing explicit acknowledgement violated code of respect for dead officers, even when understanding that their deaths had been motivated by legitimate grievance against judicial system that had executed innocent man. Clarence was buried beside James in cemetery on family property, simple gravestone listing name and dates, without reference to November 1951, events that had defined his life after brother's execution. But visitors to cemetery would gather at gravesite, tell stories about mountain ghost who'd hunted 19 deputies, transform Clarence into folk hero, whose legendary status grew with each retelling until separating actual events from embellished narratives became impossible for those who hadn't lived through 1951 and didn't know truth from regional legend. The stories emphasized tactical sophistication and systematic nature of campaign, mountain ghost's supernatural ability to evade capture despite massive manhunt, poetic justice that officers who'd executed innocent man had been eliminated by brother they'd never suspected capable of sustained violence. The 1990s brought renewed interest in Clarence's story when North Carolina established Commission on Actual Innocence in 1993, state agency tasked with reviewing wrongful conviction claims and recommending pardons for cases where post-conviction evidence proved defendants had been innocent. James Raby's case was among first examined by Commission, obvious candidate for posthumous exoneration. Given that actual murderer had confessed and been executed for crime James had been wrongfully convicted of committing. Commission's investigation confirmed what Attorney General McMullen had found in 1952, that James had been innocent, that Kevin Patterson's testimony had been perjured, that Samuel Patterson had been actual perpetrator, that judicial system's failures had resulted in executing wrong man, who'd then been denied justice, when actual murderer's confession had been dismissed rather than investigated. Commission recommended in 1995 that Governor James Hunt grant full posthumous pardon based on innocence, first such pardon in North Carolina history, formal acknowledgement that state had executed innocent man, and should officially recognize error that had been covered up for 44 years, despite overwhelming evidence proving James hadn't committed murder. Hunt granted pardon to August 15, 1995, 44th anniversary of James's execution, ceremony attended by William and Sarah Raby, who accepted pardon on behalf of father who'd maintained innocence until final moment before dying in electric chair. Hunt's statement accompanying pardon was carefully worded apology acknowledging profound failure of justice, while avoiding explicit admission of state liability that might have triggered additional compensation claims from James's children who'd grown up without father because prosecutor had been ambitious, and deputies had been incompetent, and judge had denied new trial despite evidence proving innocence. The posthumous pardon generated controversy throughout North Carolina, law enforcement organizations objecting that official acknowledgement of wrongful conviction appeared to justify Clarence's systematic violence against 19 officers, that granting pardon 44 years after execution sent message that cop killing could be excused when motivated by legitimate grievance against judicial system. Families of dead officers expressed particular anger that state was officially acknowledging wrongful conviction that everyone had known about since 1951, but that hadn't been formally recognized until after both James's wife and brother, who'd known absolutely of his innocence, had died without seeing official vindication they'd fought for throughout lives. The controversy reflected deep divisions about whether acknowledging past wrongs was appropriate, even when doing so appeared to validate violent responses to those wrongs, whether state should publicly admit failures even when admissions complicated moral judgments about violence that had been triggered by those failures. William and Sarah Raby used posthumous pardon as foundation for civil rights lawsuit filed in 1996 seeking damages for wrongful execution, arguing that state's official acknowledgement of innocence established liability for judicial murder that had destroyed their family and had cost father his life. The lawsuit sought $10 million in damages, amount that reflected decades of lost income and emotional suffering that James's execution had inflicted on children who'd grown up knowing father had been innocent but unable to obtain official acknowledgement until both parents had died. North Carolina Attorney General moved to dismiss lawsuit in 1997, argued that posthumous pardon didn't establish legal liability because state had sovereign immunity from suits based on judicial proceedings, that recognizing wrongful conviction wasn't admission of constitutional violations that would support damage awards. The case was settled in 1998 for undisclosed amount reportedly between $2 and $3 million, state agreeing to payment without admitting liability, characterizing settlement as compassionate resolution rather than acknowledgement that constitutional violations had occurred when prosecutor had relied on perjured testimony and when judge had denied new trial despite evidence proving innocence. William and Sarah accepted settlement, despite believing amount was inadequate compensation for losing father to wrongful execution, understanding that continuing litigation might take years and might ultimately result in judicial ruling that sovereign immunity barred recovery regardless of how egregious prosecutorial and judicial failures had been. Settlement agreement included confidentiality clause, preventing William and Sarah from discussing amount publicly, but leaked information suggested state had concluded that settling was preferable to trial that would have generated negative publicity about wrongful execution and systematic cover-up that had continued for 44 years after actual murderer's confession. The 21st century brought final chapters in Raby family story when documentary filmmaker Patricia Morrison produced comprehensive examination of James's wrongful conviction and Clarence's systematic violence. The Mountain Ghost, Justice and Vengeance in 1951 North Carolina, premiered in 2015, featured interviews with historians, with William and Sarah Raby describing families' suffering and Clarence's devotion to supporting them after father's execution, with children and grandchildren of 19 dead officers expressing continuing anger that Mountain Ghost had never been prosecuted and had been celebrated as folk hero throughout Rutherford County despite killing their grandfathers. Documentary presented most balanced account possible given competing narratives, acknowledged both judicial system's catastrophic failures and Clarence's systematic violence as components of tragedy where institutional incompetence and individual retribution had combined to create suffering extending far beyond immediate participants. most powerful segment featured joint interview with Sarah Raby, age 71 in 2015, and James's daughter, and Thomas Webb, age 68, grandson of Deputy Marcus Webb, who'd led inadequate investigation resulting in James's wrongful conviction and who'd been killed by Clarence in systematic elimination campaign. Sarah described growing up knowing father had been innocent, watching mother struggle financially and emotionally, while state refused to acknowledge obvious error, feeling that Uncle Clarence's violence had been understandable, if not justifiable, response when legal system had executed wrong man and then covered up mistake. Thomas described how grandfather's death had destroyed family economically, how learning details of inadequate investigation had complicated understanding of whether grandfather bore responsibility for tragedy or had been scapegoat for systemic failures he hadn't personally created. The exchange revealed unbridgeable gap between competing perspectives, Sarah unable to acknowledge that Uncle's systematic violence had inflicted permanent harm on innocent families, whose breadwinners had died pursuing enforcement operations, even if those operations had been based on incompetent investigation. Thomas unable to accept that grandfather's investigative failures had created a situation where wrongful execution seemed inevitable and where brother's violent response appeared justified to community that had watched judicial murder proceed despite opportunities to prevent it. Documentary director Morrison explained in commentary that she'd hoped interview would demonstrate possibility of reconciliation between families affected by 1951 events, but instead it had revealed that 64 years wasn't sufficient time for healing wounds created when judicial system had executed innocent man and when brother had systematically eliminated 19 officers who'd participated in wrongful conviction. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered FBI files showing that several officers killed by Clarence had expressed doubts about James's guilt, had filed internal complaints questioning whether investigation had been adequate, had participated in arrest and prosecution reluctantly because refusing would have ended careers. Files documented that at least 4 deputies had told supervisors privately that case against James seemed weak, that relying entirely on confidential informant without physical evidence created risk of wrongful conviction, that alibi witnesses deserved more thorough evaluation before case proceeded to trial seeking death penalty. The information complicated narrative that all 19 officers bore equal responsibility for wrongful conviction suggested Clarence's systematic elimination hadn't discriminated between those primarily culpable and those following orders they'd privately questioned. Families of deputies who'd expressed doubts were particularly angry that their grandfathers had died, despite trying to prevent exactly the kind of rushed investigation that had resulted in wrongful execution, argued that Mountain Ghost's violence had been indiscriminate revenge rather than targeted justice against those most responsible for judicial murder. Sarah Raby defended Uncle's decision to eliminate all 19 officers, argued that everyone who'd participated in wrongful conviction bore collective responsibility regardless of private reservations, that allowing some officers to survive because they'd questioned investigation would have left witnesses who could have testified about Clarence's methods and identity. But William Raby published response essay, acknowledging that some officers killed had been reluctant participants whose deaths represented tragedy within larger tragedy, that Uncle's violence had exceeded proportional response even while recognizing that wrongful execution had created impossible situation where no response would have been adequate. The revelation sparked intense debate within Raby family about how Uncle's legacy should be remembered, whether celebrating systematic elimination of 19 officers required ignoring that some victims had opposed investigation that triggered violence, whether honoring Clarence meant defending all his actions or acknowledging moral complexity that made simple, heroic narratives inadequate. The debate reflected generational differences in how violence was evaluated, older family members maintaining traditional position that Clarence had delivered justice system denied, younger generation more willing to question whether killing deputies who'd expressed doubts about James's guilt had been necessary, or whether Uncle's campaign had been partly motivated by rage that exceeded defensive response to wrongful execution. By 2024, James Raby's grave had become pilgrimage site for wrongful conviction activists and opponents of death penalty, location where visitors could confront reality that judicial system had executed innocent man, based on perjured testimony and inadequate investigation. That actual murderer's confession, 3 weeks after execution, had been dismissed rather than acknowledged as proof of error. Tour guides presented complicated narrative, acknowledging both systems' catastrophic failures and Clarence's systematic violence, neither celebrating Mountain Ghost as hero nor condemning him as terrorist, but recognizing that his actions existed in moral complexity where legitimate grievance about wrongful execution didn't fully justify killing 19 officers, including some who'd questioned investigation. Historical marker at graveside captured irreducible complexity. James Raby was wrongfully convicted and executed August 15, 1951, for murder committed by Samuel Patterson, who confessed 3 weeks after execution. District Attorney dismissed confession to protect career, postponing official acknowledgement of innocence until posthumous pardon granted 1995, 44 years after judicial murder. James's brother Clarence systematically eliminated 19 law enforcement officers involved in wrongful conviction, including several who'd privately questioned investigation but participated because refusing would have ended careers. This grave reminds us that executing innocent people creates suffering extending far beyond immediate victim, that wrongful convictions trigger responses. Judicial system cannot prevent when families possess capability for systematic violence, and that neither official justice through posthumous pardons nor unofficial justice through elimination of responsible parties can repair damage created when state kills wrong person. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of wrongful execution and violent response across 73 years, the judicial system's catastrophic failures that executed innocent man, then dismissed actual murderer's confession for 44 years, the 19 officers who died, including some who'd questioned investigation, the family's decades-long fight for acknowledgement that came too late for James's wife and brother to witness, the impossible questions about whether killing deputies who'd expressed doubts was justified, or whether systematic elimination exceeded proportional response to wrongful execution. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories that force examination of what happens when judicial system executes innocent people, and how families respond when legal remedies prove inadequate, that acknowledge both catastrophic institutional failures and violent responses that themselves create injustice, that demonstrate how wrongful executions destroy multiple families across generations, regardless of whether official or unofficial justice eventually emerges. Comment about whether posthumous pardon 44 years after execution represents appropriate acknowledgement or inadequate response to judicial murder, whether Clarence was justified eliminating all 19 officers or should have discriminated between those primarily responsible and reluctant participants, whether settlement amount was adequate compensation for children who grew up without father because state executed wrong man. Because these questions persist wherever wrongful convictions occur, wherever judicial systems' failures trigger violent responses that themselves violate justice, wherever acknowledging past wrongs appears to validate violence that wrong triggered, wherever families must decide how to remember ancestors whose actions defended honor while destroying innocent families. Until next time, remember that James Raby was executed for murder he didn't commit. That actual murderer confessed 3 weeks after execution and was dismissed as attention-seeking. That 19 officers died because brother possessed military training and determination to deliver justice state denied. That posthumous pardon came 44 years too late for those who'd known absolutely of innocence. And that ultimately wrongful executions create suffering that persists across generations, affecting all participants, regardless of whether justice eventually emerges through official acknowledgement or unofficial violence, that itself becomes crime-deserving examination rather than simple celebration or condemnation.